Hello, my dear students. So now we are with another lecture for BA Sem 6 students of Special English. The paper number is 315E by A. And the paper is the English language teaching and spoken English. You know, my dear students, this is an important paper. It helps you to use the English language effectively. It also teaches you a lot about the importance of communicating the right way. We're not going to talk about rules of grammar. I'm going to be looking at Unit 2 of this paper, 315 by E by A. Unit 2, the first topic is 6 basic verb patterns. At your stage, I don't have to tell you what a verb is. I don't have to tell you that verbs usually have a subject. What we are really going to look at is what happens after the verb. You have a subject, you have a verb, but what happens after the verb? And generally, in our communicative approach to English language usage, we believe that there are 6 basic verb patterns. Of course, I'm going to be using a few grammar terms. But as we go along, I'll also tell you a little bit about those terms. We are not going to look at any rules, I'm reminding you. We're going to look at how we can use these verb patterns to convey what we want to convey. So without wasting more time, let me just tell you what these basic verb patterns are. They are SVC, SVVO, I'll say that again, SVO, SVOV, SVOO, SVOC, and SV. I don't have to repeat that S is subject and verb is S is subject and V is verb. So let's go along. What are we looking at? We are looking at C, we are looking at O, we are looking at OO, we are looking at OC, and we are looking at something where there's nothing after the verb. So shall we begin with the first one? The first verb pattern in our 6 basic verb patterns is SVC. S is the subject. You can have any noun there to begin with. V is the verb. And C is the complement. What do I mean by that? Let's look at a couple of sentences. Raju appears happy. She is a doctor. We are all Indians. The student is ambitious. Look at all these examples that I've given you, my dear students, and you would notice that there is a subject, she or we or I or Raju or whatever. It's followed by a verb, appears, is, are, etc., etc. And then there is another word. If I take one example, Raju appears happy. Raju is the subject, appear is the verb. What is happy? We shouldn't jump to the conclusion that because it comes after the verb, it has to be the object. No. Because happy refers to Raju. Who is happy? Who appears happy? Raju appears happy. She is a doctor. Who is a doctor? She. So she and doctor are the same. So doctor is a complement of she. These verbs like appear and smell and taste and seems, etc., and is and are and was, they are all called also linking verbs. Another word that we use for that is also cupola. C-U-P-O-L-A. Now these verbs can be either current verbs. For example, it smells good. It tastes lovely. She appears happy. etc. They could also be resulting verbs. That means the verb shows a kind of progress. So what do you have? For example, you could have she grows tall. She turns smart. Now these words are what are called resulting verbs. So what do we have? The first verb pattern that we have looked at is SVC. Let's move on. The second basic pattern that we are looking at is SVO, which is probably the easiest for you because you have subject, verb, object. I teach English. I is the subject, teach is the verb, and English is the object. How is it different from the first one, SVC? Because I am not English. I teach what? I teach English. They play cricket. Hamid bought a book. John loves cricket. All these are examples of SVO. Very, very simple, my dear students. And I think probably the maximum use that we make of the verb in the English language, in general speaking, probably is the verb pattern SVO. Let's move on to the next one, which is SVOO. What is that? There are two objects. In the first one, where it is SVO, I teach English. So I subject, teach verb, English object. I teach my students English. What do we have there? We've got two objects. I is the subject, teach is the verb. Teach whom? Teach my students. Teach what? Teach English. So this construction is called, this verb pattern is called SVOO, ditransitive. The first one was monotransitive, here it is ditransitive, ditransitive. That means there are two objects. The mother cooked a meal for her children. Cooked what? Cooked for whom? Cooked a meal for her children. We can go on and on with examples. SVO and SVOO can both also be in passive form. I think you can do a quick thinking and see how it can become passive. For example, let's take SVO. So what do we have? You have Sheetal cleaned the room. Sheetal, subject, cleaned, verb, the room, object. Sheetal cleaned the room is active. The room was cleaned by Sheetal becomes passive, but you still have a subject, verb, and an object. The order, as you know, my dear students, in passive is different, but that doesn't matter. By now, after all, you're students of Sem 6, you know a lot about English usage. Let's move on to the next verb pattern, which is verb pattern 4. And what is that? That is SVOV. So you have a subject, you have a verb, you have an object, but then you have another verb. What do I mean by that? Can I go back to my first sentence? I teach English. I teach my students English, which you had SVO and then SVOO. But suppose I say, I teach my students to speak English. I teach my students to speak English. I is the subject, teach is the verb, my students is O, which is the object, and then you have a V. What is that V? It's a verb. To speak English. I teach my students to speak English. This would be an example of SVOV. Subject, verb, object, verb. You can think of many more sentences, right? My coach taught me to play cricket. My coach, subject, taught, verb, me, object, to play cricket. To play, right? You've got the verb. Of course, the verb can be in different forms. For example, if I say, my teacher, my guru, taught me singing. My guru, subject, taught, verb. Me, right, object. Singing, singing again is another form of the verb. So my guru taught me singing. I teach my students to speak English. We can go on and on. You must think of your own examples, my dear students, to ensure that you have really understood what we are talking about. I cannot give you 100 examples. I'll give you 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe, and then you will have to work on that. So what have we looked at? We have looked at SVC, SVO, SVOO, SVOC. Sorry, SVOV. Let me repeat that. What have we looked at? SVC, SVO, SVOO, and SVOV. That leaves us with 2 more, the 5th and the 6th verb pattern. So what is the 5th verb pattern? SVOC. SVO. You know all these 3, subject, verb, object. But now we have C, which means a complement. And this complement, unlike the first SVC, is a complement of the object. For example, I find English useful. I find English useful. I is the subject, find is the verb, English is the object. And what does useful tell us? Or about what does useful tell us? It tells us something about the object. That means it's a complement of the object. Unlike I am an Indian, where that Indian told us something about the subject, and therefore we called it SVC. This is an example of SVOC. What is it? Subject, verb, object, complement. So what do we have? Rashid finds this book useful. I thought the party noisy. Do you get that? I thought the party noisy. So you have I subject, you have thought verb, the party you've got as object, and noisy is the complement of the object. That is number 6. A quick recap. SVC, SVO, SVOO, SVOV, SVOC. And the last one, the 6th pattern, verb pattern that I'm going to be talking to you about is SV. There's a subject and there's a verb, but there's no object, there's no 2 objects, there's no complement, etc. These are sentences like, she smiled. Samira paused. Nishita laughed. The old man died, etc., etc. Remember, I cannot say I bought and say this is an example of SV because the sentence sounds incomplete. You will immediately ask me, bought what? So you can't just have a subject and a verb and say, ma'am, here's an example of subject-verb pattern. No, these are sentences which are complete. For example, when I say she laughed, he smiled, the baby cried, she was sleeping, I am talking. Now remember, in all these sentences, the examples that I've just given you, the sentence is complete. You can put a full stop after the verb. And these are examples of the verb pattern SV. Can you understand, my dear students, how the verb that we choose probably also determines what comes after that? For example, in SV, you don't need an object, you don't need a complement. But there are verbs, right? There are verbs. For example, if you say she seems and you can't stop, you can't stop. You'll have to say something. But if I say I smiled, if I say I laughed, if you say the old man died, if you say the baby cried, you can see that the sentences are all complete. So what have we done in this lecture, my dear students? Unit 2 of paper 315E by A. We have looked at the basic verb patterns. There are 6 of them and you have to remember them. Doesn't matter the order in which you remember, as long as you understand what it means, how it is used, when is it used, what does it convey. So what do we have? We have SVC, we have SVO, we have SVOO, we have SVOV, we have SVOC, and we have SV. Very quickly, SVC, she is a teacher. SVO, Shahrukh bought an apple. SVOO, the mother cooked food. SVOV, Hamid asked John to stay. SVOC, I think exercise useful. And SVOC, Shehnaz laughed. Is that clear, my dear students? Go back, look at the prescribed book, look at more examples, and I'm sure you'll be able to use all the 6 verb patterns very well. Thank you very much. As we continue with the lockdown in our country, stay home, stay safe, stay blessed. All the best, my dear students.